All righty. So, Corey, when I said I was going to do this series, you were one of the people who was requested multiple times, pretty much immediately. You were on the list anyway. Like
Hmm.
you were definitely among the people I really wanted to talk to. But a bunch of people requested you, which kind of made me think about some stuff. It's like I know you from your digital rights work. Like that's where I know you the most, and that's why I started following you and have for quite some time. I'm not as familiar with some of the other sides of your work, but you are one of those people where you pretty much just invented your own lane in so many ways. And so I guess to start out here, how would you describe what you do to a stranger? Like if somebody wasn't familiar with all the things you do, like where would you kind of take them?
Well, to be honest, I generally just figure out whatever it is relevant to them out of the things that I do, and I just say, "Oh, I'm a writer, or I work on tech policy, or whatever." Um, I lived in London for 13 years, and before I became a citizen, every time I came back to the UK, which was very often, I was the European director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, so I was on the road 27 days a month. And every time I came back into the UK, I had to fill in one of these paper landing cards. And there was a little tiny, like, 1 inch blank for occupation, and I would just like look at that blank and go, Jesus Christ, what do I write in there? And my grandmother would go through this too because she wanted to brag on me to her friends, but she didn't know what to say. So eventually she said, he works with computers, which I think covers a lot of ground. I think you could be like in the FBI or like Sam Bankman Fried, and that would still cover it. So yeah.
What would you write in that little line typically?
Usually writer.
Writer?
I write science fiction novels. I write nonfiction. I work for a digital human rights group and have for 20 years. I am a blogger and I helped start one of the biggest blogs online, Boing Boing, and wrote it for 20 years. I am involved in all kinds of sort of creative pursuits. I'm an ex-Imagineer and I worked on Disney theme park stuff. And I'm, you know, I have a wide range of interests that I write on very actively. I write a newsletter every day, and it covers everything from uh, how to talk about art to what the informatics in your car engine tells us about whether capitalism has given way to feudalism. And I always figure specialization is for insects.
Love it. Is capitalism giving way to feudalism?
I mean, I'm reading this book by Yanis Varoufakis right now that makes that case. I think it's a really provocative thesis. He's basically says, look, since the Communist Manifesto, socialists have been saying that capitalism is riven by contradictions that will eventually tear it apart. But they've also noted, including in the Communist Manifesto, that capitalism is endlessly creative in reinventing itself for whatever new circumstances arrive. So don't get too frisky and think that capitalism is about to disappear. And Varoufakis says that around 2008, with the great financial crisis, capitalism finally did die, but it wasn't replaced by socialism. It was replaced by feudalism, and not feudalism just in the kind of like, everybody calls everyone they disagree with a fascist, and everyone who they thinks is old fashioned a caveman, and everyone who they think is stuck up a feudalist. He means, like, specifically, feudalism is a economic system where the people at the top of the chain and the systems organization is oriented around extracting rents. And rents are income that you get for owning something that other people use to produce. And income or profits are things that you get for producing things that cost you less to make than you sell them. So on the one hand, we have a lot of companies that are wildly unprofitable but have a lot of income, right? So think of during the great financial crisis and afterwards, and then during the COVID bailouts, you had airlines and automakers and mortgage originators that had lost gigantic amounts of money in the sense that the products that they made sold ultimately for a lot less than they paid to make them, but were still extremely still had a lot of surplus income. He wouldn't call it profits. He would call it rents. They still
Hmm.
received a lot of rents, by owning things that other people needed in order to get stuff done. And he says that today, if you look at a marketplace like Amazon, it might look like a capitalist enterprise, and Amazon is in fact stuffed full of capitalists who are making products and bringing them to market to sell them. But Amazon itself is feudal in the sense that Amazon is like a bustling city center filled with independent stores, but one guy, the guy who owns the city center, decides what the stores can sell, decides where they shelve their goods, gets 51 cents out of every dollar that they earn, and can kick any merchant out whenever they want. So his point isn't that capitalism went away. His point is that capitalism has been subsumed into feudalism. And there was capitalism, under feudalism as well, right? There were people who traded things and bought things and sold things and made things. They just were subordinated to people who owned things. And he says we are back in that world where owning something is more important than doing something, and where the economy's central organizing principle is if you own something, the economy is responsive to your needs. Whereas if you do something, you're going to have to subordinate your interests to the people who own things.
Wow. What's the name of the book again?
Well, it's coming out in October. It's called Techno Feudalism: Who Killed Capitalism, or What Killed
Oh,
Capitalism.
interesting.
I'm going to finish it after we talk today and send him a quote for the cover.
Oh, right on.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Um, so let's back up a little bit. What spawned your interest in digital rights and tech policy? Like where did that initiate for you just in your life?
Well, in some ways, it comes from the same place as my interest in science fiction, which is that I grew up in a household uh, where the things that our household revolved around were technology, because my dad was a computer scientist and my mom was an early childhood educator with a strong interest in how digital systems could help teach young children, and also politics and human rights. So my parents were union organizers, they were anti-nuclear proliferation organizers, they were feminist organizers. My mom was instrumental in the fight to legalize abortion in Canada, and they were also, both of them, very interested in how human rights intersected with technology. And then, my dad especially, but my mom also, were really into technological speculation, speculative fiction, and the idea that you could, in the act of speculation itself, do something radical. If you think about Margaret Thatcher and the neoliberal project of the kind of Thatcher, Reagan, Mulroney era, her rallying cry was there is no alternative, right? Like, on the one hand, she wanted you to imagine a world in which everything was commodified and organized around markets, and everything was bought and sold, and there was nothing that was owned in common or provided in common. But on the other hand, she wanted you not to try to imagine anything else. So I've been trying to come up with like a non-jargony name for this, but the jargony name that, if you were like a theorist, you would call this, is hegemonic and anti-hegemonic imagination. So hegemonic imagination is to imagine one thing and nothing else, to insist on a kind of inevitablism. This is like the Vogons in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Resistance is futile, or the motto over the motto that over the gates of hell that Dante put there in the Divine Comedy, which was abandon hope, all ye who enter here. Right? Like, nothing will change. This is the only way it can be. We are at the end of history. This is human nature. It's built in. It can't be changed. These are unalterable facts. If you say anything different, you are engaged in fantasy and not in speculation or scenario building. And so that's hegemonic narrative. Counter hegemonic narrative is there's always an alternative, right? Like, anything can be anything. We could do something a different way. We could organize our society around a completely different set of principles. And, there's a book by a sadly departed friend of mine, David Graeber, that he wrote with David Wengrow. Graeber was an anthropologist, Wengrow's an archaeologist, called The Dawn of Everything, which explores the latest science about prehistory and what we know about prehistory. And there's a story about prehistory that's really dominant that says that, like, first we were hunter gatherers and we lived in small groups, and we had a lot of autonomy. And then we invented agriculture and we had to settle down, and we created hierarchical societies that expropriated the surplus from agriculture, but also created like science and stuff, because there were like people who could like beat up anyone who wouldn't share their food, and then didn't have to work in the fields, and they could just sit around and like write poetry and think about science. And that this is like this inevitable way that we go. And when you actually look at the ruins of ancient civilizations, you see evidence of like every conceivable way of organizing yourself. You see super authoritarian hunter-gatherer tribes. You see giant cities that had no housing for bureaucrats or lords, right? So like that were seemingly totally self-organizing and egalitarian. And you see everything in between, right? Big distributed authoritarian societies, big concentrated anti-authoritarian societies, all of it. Which is to say that like everything is possible, right? The science fiction idea of like what if only if this goes on, the idea that you can always contest the narrative, right? That we choose what society we're going to live in, and that it's not down to human nature or the foundational characteristics of our technology or whatever. That, you know, within that constraints of who we are and how long we live and what we need to survive and what we know how to do, that we can organize those things in any way. We can choose to use technologies, not to use technologies. We can choose to organize the technologies in different ways. You know, the Luddites get this rap as being like technophobes. The Luddites, who were like the textile workers who rose up against the automated textile machinery, they took 7-year apprenticeships using the most advanced technology of their day. These were people who had the equivalent of like an MIT master's in engineering. And what they objected to, it wasn't like they were scared of steam looms, right? They were angry that their bosses, first of all, wanted to make bad textiles because the product that came off of them was bad, and that the machines were, quote, so simple a child could use them, and that what their bosses wanted to do was fire their asses, go to London, where there were these orphanages full of children whose parents had died in the Napoleonic Wars, kidnap those children to the English North, where they were industrializing, and lock them inside the factory for 10-year indentures, where they would be maimed and killed and starved and beaten by these machines. And, you know, their point wasn't like we shouldn't have textile machines. Their point was there is nothing inevitable about chaining children to textile machines for 10 years and having the floor run with their blood, right? That like what's important is not what the machine does, but who it does it for and who it does it to. So, you know, when you combine this technological upbringing with this policy upbringing, with this imaginative upbringing, and this idea that imagination is a force for liberation, that like I kind of landed exactly where I was gonna, you know.
It's an amazing answer. So how did you initially sync up with the EFF?
Oh, that's funny. You know, I everyone who was involved with early network communications and got a modem in the early 80s, I was very excited to be on the internet in the early days, and on the proto internet, BBSs and BBSs that had Usenet gateways and FidoNet gateways and all kinds of things. And I ended up with some of the people I met on those BBSs doing a startup. We did an open, and we raised a lot of money in the capital markets. There was a lot of money sloshing around, so we raised like $19 million. And then Napster not only got sued, but its investors got sued. And not only did its investors get sued, but like their investors got sued. So it wasn't just their VCs; it was like the insurance companies that had given the VCs money to gamble with. And all of a sudden, every VC that had a peer-to-peer company in their portfolio went, "Oh my God, we are going to die." And so they showed up at our door and they were like, "Whatever you're doing, stop right now. Don't get us sued. Don't get our partners sued. You're going to, you know, like, don't ruin us. Explain why it is we shouldn't just pull the plug on you now." And a bunch of our programmers had come from the Cult of the Dead Cow, who were this early hacker group. Beto O'Rourke revealed recently that he was a member when he was a teenager. That
Oh
was
wow.
a secret. And CDC had gotten like terrorized by tech companies, notably Microsoft. They released a tool that exploited the back office management tool that let network administrators manage their client PCs. They released a tool called Back Orifice that let you take over any computer, any Windows PC in the world and completely control it, just basically to prove that Microsoft had built this very dangerous interface and failed to secure it. And we're just terrorized by Microsoft. So EFF had defended them. And when we got into legal trouble, our programmers were like, you need to talk to EFF. And so first we had this conference call with them and me, like all around, like one of those old Nortel phones on someone's desk at the office. And then, I moved out to the Bay Area to open our San Francisco office. This was all in Toronto, where I grew up. And I started spending more time with them. And it became really clear that I was a .org guy. I was not a .com guy.
Hmm.
And Microsoft was going to buy our company. And they were going to make me be a DRM evangelist, which is like, if you know anything about me, that is just hilariously bad. That's like, you know, putting Andrea Dworkin in charge of Playboy or something. Like it's a very weird mismatch. And I just was like, actually, you know what? I'm going to go work for EFF instead. So the company had been taken over by our VCs because they were like, oh, if Microsoft is going to buy you, we're just going to like pull this really slippery shit and seize control of the company and take a bunch of the founder shares so that we can get a big payday. And so I'd had my shares gutted, and they were going to move me back to Toronto. And there was a moving van on my way on its way from Toronto to my apartment in San Francisco to pick up my stuff. And I was flying back to Toronto to look at apartments, to look at actually a spare room in one of our programmers' houses to go live in. And as I was about to leave town, I was at the airport. I got a call from the executive director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who was then Sherry Steele. And Sherry was like, we want to offer you a job. And I was like, oof, I'm about to leave San Francisco and move to Toronto. And she said, well, the job is here if you change your mind. And I was like, give me the weekend to think about it. And I got back on Monday and I called her up and I took the job. And she was like, I was 100% sure you were not going to take this job. And now it's been, I think, 22 years and I'm still with him. So I think it was the right call.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what needs to change about copyright law?
You know, I I think it depends on what problem we're trying to solve here. So I wrote this book last year. So I wrote 8 books during lockdown. I write when I'm anxious. So as I talk about the books I have out and coming out, it's going to get confusing. I freely stipulate to that. But I wrote a book last year with my colleague Rebecca Giblin from the University of Melbourne. She's a copyright expert, about how it is that the copyright has gotten like stronger consistently for 40 years. Like it covers more kinds of works, it covers them for a longer time. The penalties for violating copyright are harsher. It's easier to prove an infringement and get those penalties. And the things that are considered infringement are broader. And that has happened every time we change copyright for 40 years. And yet, even though the entertainment companies themselves are much larger and more profitable than they've ever been, the income that goes to creators, both as a share of the income that goes to the entertainment companies and just in real terms, like how much money you've got in the bank at the end of the month, the share of income going to creators has gone down over those 40 years. And we wanted to figure out what the hell happened. And what we concluded is that when you are in an industry that has 5 publishers and 4 studios and 3 record labels and 2 ad tech companies and 1 company that controls all the ebooks and all the audiobooks, that giving a creator more copyright, right? That is to say, a right that you have to bargain with as an individual with an employer, with another firm in order to get paid, that under those conditions, giving the creator more copyright, it's like giving your bullied kid extra lunch money, right? There isn't an amount of lunch money you give that kid that will get them lunch. In fact, if you
Mm,
just keep giving that kid lunch money, the bullies are going to get such a fat bank balance that they'll just peel off some money and like run a global campaign saying, won't someone think of the hungry children? Give them more
Mm.
lunch money, right? Like the zombie in Dawn of the Dead who picks up the cop radio and says, send more cops, right? Send more copyright, right? So like today, we have the studios who spent the last 20 years telling us not to copy DVDs, proposing that they're going to copy actors,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And like it's pretty clear that like there are some problems too much copyright creates for lots of other people. But I think the thing that is really wrong with copyright is that the way we solve this problem is not with copyright. The way we solve this problem, and you know, I'll say choke point capitalism, the first half of the book is just like these dissections of these eye-watering scams that the tech companies and the entertainment companies use to rip off artists. And they're just like, you know, really like gross accounting scams. There's a term out of securities called MIGO, my eyes glaze over. It's when you've got a prospectus that's like so complicated that no one can focus on it, and they assume that a pile of shit this big has to have a pony underneath it somewhere, and they just
Mm.
sign the prospectus. And all of these scams work like that. We spend the first half of the book doing it. We hear from people that by the end, by the time they've reached the end of the first half, they've got this like alarming high-pitched noise in their head that's their incipient rage aneurysm, and they want to put the book down. But the second half of the book is devoted to like a half dozen extremely detailed, shovel-ready policy things that governments, lawmakers, technologists, and artist groups can do in order to actually change the amount of money that's in the system that goes to artists. Right? It's not about like growing the pie. It's about giving a bigger piece of the pie to artists. For a long time, the true fans of neoliberal capitalism have said like, don't worry about how big your slice of the pie is. Worry about how to make the pie as big as possible. And like, there's some sense in which that is true, right? If you're going to get a third of the pie and the pie quintuples in size, that's great. But if your slice of the pie keeps getting smaller and smaller, even as the pie gets bigger, it doesn't matter how big the pie gets, you're going to starve, right? And so, like, for example, there is this widespread problem with everyone who gets royalties, which is that if you audit your royalty statement, you will often find that some of your royalties went missing, that you're being stolen from. And
Mm.
we cite a company here in Los Angeles that audits record company royalty statements. And they've done tens of thousands of audits over 30 years. And in all of these audits, in every instance in which they found a discrepancy in the accounting, except one, the discrepancy was in the favor of the label and not the artist. Right. So this must be due to some kind of horrible localized probability storm that's very vexing for their CPAs, that just makes all of the errors go in their employer's favor. But when you, as the artist, notice that you've been stolen from and you say, hey, you stole my money, the label says, oh, you musicians are adorable, but you can't do math. We don't actually owe you anything, and you can't afford to sue us. But tell you what, we're good natured slobs. We'll give you half of what we owe you, what you say we owe you. And all you have to do is sign this non disclosure agreement where you have to promise not to tell anyone else how we stole from you, because we're stealing from everyone else in the same way. You can't go around and tell all your buddies so they show up asking for their money too. Now, contract is a matter of state law. And almost all of these contracts are settled in 4 states because that's how monopoly works. You've got California, New York, Washington State because the games companies and Amazon. You got Tennessee because of Nashville. If we were to amend one or all of those state contract laws, and remember, state laws are a lot easier to amend than federal regulations or laws, to say that as a matter of public policy, non-disclosure cannot be enforced where it pertains to material misstatements or omissions that were down to the detriment of people owed a royalty, then at the stroke of the pen, we put more money in more creators' pockets than 40 years of copyright term extension combined, right? It's like a crack in the machine. We stick a lever in it, we wiggle it around, and money pours out of the machine and into artists' pockets, right? So like term extension, copyright scope extension, all of this stuff is the right to be angry at your audience for listening to your music and reading your books the wrong way without getting paid for it. But amending contract law is the right to like put groceries on your table and put braces on your kids' teeth and pay your goddamn mortgage, right? So one of the things that we need to fix about copyright, is we've got to get artists to stop like going like the first thing we reach for whenever anything goes wrong is the copyright lever. Right. So you got the AI fight right now, which is like a real live fight. I don't want to pretend it's not. And you got a bunch of creators out there who are genuinely and legitimately worried that their bosses want to fire their asses and replace them with a shell script. And that is 100% true. And their bosses will do it even if the script sucks, even if the software sucks. Because, like, we've all called a switchboard that's now run by an interactive voice response system that replaced a human operator who is good at their job. And the IVR is terrible at its job. And,
Mhm.
you know, the boss fired that person and replaced them with bad software. We should, like, legit be worried that our bosses want to fire us and replace us with software. So then you get these people who are like, okay, well, you can't do that without taking our work and training the model. So maybe we should sue the companies that make the models for taking our work for copyright infringement. And there's a problem with that, which is that it's just empirically not a copyright infringement, right? Like all the settled law of copyright says that making a transient copy of a work for the purpose of mathematical analysis and study, it's just not a copyright infringement. Like I'm on the kind of radical fringe of copyright reform, but my arch nemesis, like the people who wouldn't piss on me if I was on fire, this is the only thing we agree on, is that this is just fair use, right? Like a model like Midjourney takes an image and reduces it to a single byte. Retaining a single byte from a 2 megabyte image is not a copyright infringement. It just isn't. So on the one hand, they're just like wrong, and they're being sold hopium by grifty 1-800 lawyers who are like, come and join my class action suit. Maybe we'll get a settlement out of these companies, because the companies don't want to talk about where their training data came from, because they probably did all kinds of sketchy shit to get it, and they don't want to go through discovery, and maybe they'll throw a settlement at it. But it's like, it's not a copyright infringement. It just isn't a copyright infringement. But maybe that's a problem with copyright law. Maybe we should fix copyright law and make it a copyright infringement. Now, will that fix the artist problem? I'm here to tell you, I think it will not, right? Because like already, if you're a voice actor and you're doing video game work, which is the largest plurality of work for voice actors, every recording session already begins with, my name is Cory Doctorow, and I hereby assign the right to train a model with this recording. And if you don't like it, you can hit the bricks, because there's someone else who'll come and do that recording session if you say no, right? So this is not a thing you solve by being like an LLC with an MFA, right? Like being a small business person who negotiates with another business. This is a thing you solve on the picket line with SAG-AFTRA and
Mhm.
with the Writers Guild. And, you know, I'm on that line a lot because I live in Burbank. It's around the corner from my house. I'm a member of the Animators Guild. We're not striking, but I go out there just to support them. And like they're you know, amazing people, right?
Yeah.
And they are fighting in the way that makes sense. But let's say that we got the copyright and the big firms were able to fire our asses and replace us with scripts because they could just require us to sign that copyright over. What does that do to everyone else? Well, I like, I'm not hugely impressed with I hate calling it generative AI because it's not AI, it's not artificial, it's not intelligence, but let's, for the sake of argument, call it generative AI. I don't think much of the art. I think the LLM text is like a novelty, and the novelty wears thin. I think the images are, you know, whatever, they're fine but not great. Fine. But I'm prepared to say that in 10 years, we may look back on this moment and say, oh my God, that used to be so crude. And now, like, there's a whole generation of creators making stuff that I find aesthetically very pleasing and important. And that moves me, that comes out of it. I mean, I'm also prepared to say that in 10 years, we'll look back and go, like, Jesus Christ, first it was the monkey JPEGs, and then it was that awful Midjourney crap. Can you believe the weird stuff we thought looked good back in the 2020s, right? But, you know, we lived through this before, because it used to be that sampling was just not covered by copyright. Right? Nobody even thought about its status. You know, it's like asking, like, when the horn player in a New Orleans jazz trio drops a couple of bars of That's Amore into their sample, like, do they owe, you know, a royalty, or do they need a clearance? Like, it's just does, it's like not even in the room with copyright. And so you had people who made music where they did a lot of sampling really aggressively, did really interesting things. You know, Public Enemy, like layering like 5 different snares on top of each other to get like a hyper snare, you know, that kind of thing. And then you got a bunch of artists who were angry. They said this isn't art, it's theft, it's bad art, or it can't be art because it's theft. And then and they were angry in part because they were like, I've been ripped off all my career, and now I'm getting ripped off again. And they're right. They'd been ripped off all their career. Like the Beatles, who were a white privileged act who got a better deal than like black artists. The Beatles used to have to split 1 penny 4 ways for every LP they sold, but not the whole penny, only 85% of it, because 15% was retained for marketing expenses, right? They got the good deal, right? So yeah, people were like, I've been ripped off my whole recording career. What fresh hell is this? 100% right. But when they got what they asked for, when we created a regime in which we effectively have exclusive rights over samples, the big three labels, Sony, Warner, Universal, who control 70% of all the recordings and 60% of all the compositions, amended their standard deal. So you couldn't license a sample unless you were signed to one of them. And when you signed to one of them, you had to sign away your sampling rights, which means that if you're a musician and you want to make art with a sample in it, you take money out of your advance, you give it to a record label, that record label gives it to a shareholder, not to another artist. And in order to give them that money, you have to sign up to abusive terms that pick your pocket in 100 other ways. So every artist is worse off as a result of this. No artist is richer. Every artist is poorer as a result of this. And there's a whole genre of music that can't exist anymore. So I mentioned Public Enemy. If you wanted to take A Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, which is like their best-selling album, it was the best-selling album, hip-hop album of all time, in that era, and you were going to release it now and clear all those samples, you'd have to sell every CD for $150 because you literally cannot make music with that many samples in it and still
Wow.
be profitable, right? De La Soul's music just couldn't get cleared for 15 years. It disappeared for 15 years. It started coming back in March. There's some tracks they'll never clear, but the front man of the band died in February, right? Never lived to hear his music played again in the public sphere, this hugely influential band. It's just wiped out, right? So we made all artists poorer. We made a lot of art illegal, and we banished good art to the scrap heap of history. And we didn't solve the problem of artists getting ripped off by labels. So, I think that when we say, like, what's wrong with copyright, I think the thing that's wrong with copyright is that it's a tool that can be useful when you're negotiating among relatively similar sized firms or entities of similar bargaining power. But as a labor tool to ensure that creators are fairly compensated and that creative labor is respected, copyright is extremely limited and can actually be counterproductive and can amass power in the hands of the people who are exploiting creators, which allows them to mobilize that power to exploit more creators in more grotesque ways.
Well, going on that, would you say there is still a creative class?
Totally. I mean, there are a lot of creative workers, and in fact, like the when people say, "Oh, well, like online performers are a new creative group of workers," it's 100% true, right? YouTubers, TikTokers, whatever, they are doing creative labor, and they've got the worst boss of all because, like, if you're a YouTuber, your boss is an algorithm that docks your pay every week for breaking rules that you're not allowed to know. You work on a video for hours and hours. You spend thousands of dollars out of your own pocket. You stick it on YouTube, and the people who subscribe to you, who asked explicitly to see the things that you post, never get shown that video. And it's
Hmm.
because the algorithm doesn't like you, right? And like YouTube and TikTok and all the other platforms, they say, if we explain how the algorithm worked to you, you'd figure out how to cheat, which is like your boss saying, if I told you what rule you broke that caused me to dock your paycheck, you'd figure out how to break that rule without me noticing. And we wouldn't take that from any other kind of boss, right? And so, yeah, there's a huge creative class out there doing all kinds of creative work. Kindle authors, Audible authors, people engaged in traditional publishing and music and film. They're all doing creative labor. And, some of them are earning a living and some of them wish they could earn a living and some of them are earning part of a living and some of them are doing it for other reasons that have to do with their deep and profound artistic satisfaction and and everything in between. Um, and I think that, creators suffer from this thing. I have to look up I always forget her name, the woman who came up with this term, and I always want to credit her. So give me 1 second here.
Sure.
There's this term vocational awe, uh, uh, which comes from, oh, that's it, Fobazi Ettar. So Fobazi Ettar is a librarian who coined this term vocational awe, which describes people who do their job for intrinsic reasons. And they do it because they feel like they're making a difference in the world. And vocational awe makes you very exploitable, right? You think about all the people in the caring professions, like teachers and nurses and people who work in elder care, and people who work in daycares, whose bosses are like, yeah, I'm cutting your pay again. What are you going to do? Leave your patients to get bed sores in their beds? Leave those kids with no one to like change their diapers? Like, you care about your job, right? You're going to show up. Artists are much the same, right? You'd have to, the only way to stop me from writing is to break my goddamn fingers. And, the fact is that our bosses know it, right? The force of capital understands that its workforce cares about its job, and
Mm,
that makes us exploitable. And so, what happens to creators and people in caring professions, professions with vocational awe? What happens to us is kind of a forerunner for what's going to happen to other people later, because we're the easiest ones to experiment on.
wow. That's so. I want to have like a broader question on digital rights. So when you look at everything that's happening in the digital space, and some of it we just kind of covered naturally. I mean, you brought up AI and the connection to what's happening with SAG and the WGA. That's something that's going on contemporarily. I think that there are just so many connections, no pun intended, between digital rights and labor, digital rights and climate. Yet I feel like there's not quite as much cross pollination as I would like to see between all those movements. So, two parter: one, would you agree with that? And two, if so, what do you think is the fix for that?
Well, I think it's changing. I agree that labor has been slow to get to it, but labor has been, gutted,
Hmm.
and labor movements have been gutted. There are lots of other activist movements that really see the organizing potential of the internet, right? It's like Black Lives Matter wouldn't exist without the internet. Think of the Women's March or and these other big protest movements, big political movements. Uh, the Bernie campaign, the Corbyn campaign, like all these networked activist groups that rely on digital technology as their glue. And I think that labor in general has been weak. And there's let me see if I can. I have to find her book now too. Hang on 1 sec. Uh, there's a great union organizer called oh, there it is. Jane McAlevey, uh, who talks about how corrupt unions, bad unions, bosses love those, right?
Hmm.
That like part of the reason the union that you're in sucks is your boss likes it when your union sucks, because if your union sucks, then its leadership will sell you out, and it's much cheaper for your boss to buy off the leadership than it is to buy off the whole workforce by giving them a decent deal. And so we've had corrupt unions that bosses had corrupted. We've had weak unions who had very few protections. And as a result, labor just was in like, it was on life support. And, we are seeing the first green shoots of labor in decades. And so I grew up in activist circles, as I mentioned. And when I was young, I didn't understand that this was the case. But one of the reasons that it was so easy, relatively speaking, to organize demonstrations and to, get out the vote and to get petitions going and to do all these other things is because labor provided our infrastructure, right? Like literally, if you needed a phone to use, there was a union hall with a phone you could use. If you needed a meeting room, there was a meeting room. If you needed a photocopier, there was a photocopier, right? If you needed a phone tree to turn out people for a protest, there was a phone tree. And um, labor was our foundation for everything, for the women's movement, for racial justice movements, for anti-nuclear movements, and so on. And as labor was gutted, as labor started to fail beneath us, we didn't realize it. We were standing on this floor that we'd been standing on all along. We didn't know that the foundation underneath the floor was rotting out and that the floor was going to give way. And I remember in the early 90s, just everything stopped working, right? Like the big anti-Gulf War protests, the gender issue movements, movements for Indigenous rights in Toronto. Everything just got like 100 times harder. I couldn't figure it out. And it wasn't until the 2010s that I look back and I was like, that was because we lost the labor movement. We had to like patch the floor or walk around the holes all of a sudden. And I think what happened in 1999 at the Battle of Seattle, you got the first ever mass mobilization that was post labor, right? That was organized, although unions were in it. I don't want to suggest that labor wasn't an issue, but it was a demonstration. It was a mass mobilization organized by people without the support of the labor movement. And I think that now, 20 years, 25 years after the Battle of Seattle, we see the reemergence of the labor movement off the back of what we built with the internet after 1999, right? That the kind of social justice movement, for lack of a better phrase, right? That is highly networked, much younger, and to be honest, like still figuring out what it's here for, right? What its theory of change is. That what the social justice movement has done is provided the substrate on which mass labor mobilizations can happen. And so now we're seeing, union drives in Starbucks and at Amazon and so on. And like those are just the beginnings of the fight, because after they unionize, they have to get a contract, and after they get a contract, they have to enforce the contract and all the rest of it, right? Like this is like really just the beginning. We are at like Calumet copper strike levels of labor organizing here, right? We are like at a point where like people are organizing unions when unions are effectively illegal, right? The kind of organization that is effective is no longer legal, and
Mhm.
in which our bosses are allowed to break the law when they attack our unions and our labor drives. And that's a very hard place to be in. And the cushion underneath it, the foundation underneath it, is this young, pluralistic, not hugely sophisticated in terms of class analysis, social justice movement that is starting to figure out how to integrate a labor analysis into its analysis of other intersectional problems in society. And I think it's a weird kind of cyclic thing, right? Like it's like a phoenix rising from the ashes, except it's two different phoenixes. You get social justice, and then you get labor, and then you get labor with social justice, and social justice coming out of labor, and so on
Mm.
and so on. Like it's a very odd uh, uh, kind of snake eating its tail here, but it's where we are. And the climate movement and its intersection with labor as well, I think, can be understood as an expression of that too.
So I want to be mindful of your time. I got a couple quick ones here to
Sure.
close out. So first will be a little bit of geography here. You have a lot of experience in different parts of the world. So on a basically on a policy level and then on a personal level, where would you say is kind of the best sort of like, okay, this place is leading the way as far as a society goes? And then on the personal level, where's your favorite place you've ever lived? If you could only live in one place
Uh,
forever, where would you pick out of everywhere you've ever lived?
well, I think everywhere, in terms of like who's getting it right the most, everywhere has some green shoots and some absolutely batshit nonsense.
Sure.
And like, which I think just describes the Biden cabinet, right? And Europe, I think, is getting a lot right and so much wrong right now on tech policy. And it's really about dueling factions within the European Commission and in problems intrinsic to the federalist European project, where like they make a directive and then that directive gets turned into law in 27 countries but then each of the country gets to decide like how vigorously they enforce the law. So like Ireland is just like the place where all the tech companies put their headquarters, and they don't really have a privacy commissioner, like they do, but that person like never shows up for work. They just like sit around the house in their pajamas eating cereal and watching cartoons, right? And Facebook violates the data protection regulation with every hour that God sends, and they're pretending that they're headquartered in Ireland, and so they just get away with it. It looks like maybe they'll get stopped, but like there are some big problems with the European project, but there's a lot going on in Europe that I'm really excited about. And in terms of cities I've lived in that I would live in again, I mean, I'd live in all of them again. Um, London breaks my heart because it's in such decline and getting worse, and with such bad things on its horizon. But I love London. I mean, when I go back, it's just incredible. Toronto breaks my heart, but it's on its way back. So they just elected a great leftist mayor. It's actually quite ironic. The far right loony premier of Ontario premiers like a governor, Doug Ford, who is the brother of Rob Ford, the old crack smoking mayor of
Oh
Toronto that
yeah,
everyone
yeah, everyone
knew
remembers
about.
him.
He's the smart brother, and he rammed through these extraordinary powers for mayors that were supposed to allow mayors to trample community groups. And then the largest city in the province, the city with like 6 million of the 9 million residents, elected a leftist mayor who now has all these powers. And I think the world of her. Olivia Chow, she's great. I used to ring doorbells for her when she was running for council. So that's exciting. I mean, honestly, like every Torontonian, where I want to live is New York, because the way you change a light bulb is in Toronto is you send one person to New York to make sure light bulbs are still cool. So that's like and like every cyberpunk, I want to live in Tokyo. So yeah, hard to say.
So, in closing, the last question, and this is a two-parter as well. If you had to recommend just one of your books for people to read, you can only pick one. Which one would it be? And then the second part, if you could only recommend just one book, period, any book you want, that you think people ought to read, what would
Sure.
it be?
So in terms of books, I'm just going to cheat and say like there's this one that comes out in September, The Internet Con: How to Seize the Means of Computation, which is like a detailed formula for how to fix the internet, reverse enshittification, and get the good old internet back. Um, and in terms of just reading one book, like anyone who's only like into reading one book, inevitably it's like the Bible or the Fountainhead or Mein Kampf, right? Like anyone who's just like, here's the one book you should read, like just turn around and run. So, I don't have one book. I mean, look, I have a lot of books.
That's fair. Yeah, no, I could take
Yeah,
that. That's fair. Well, thank you so much for doing this. And
my
where do
pleasure,
you
Ron.
want to? Where should people go to learn more about you?
So if you go to pluralistic.net, that's got all the links. It's got links to get my books. I do a daily newsletter that you can get either as a blog with no surveillance, no tracking, no ads, and it's Creative Commons attribution license, so you can republish it, including commercially. You can also get it as a newsletter with no tracking, no ads. I don't have beacons that let me know if you've opened the email. It's so creepy. I also syndicate it on as a Twitter thread every day, as a Tumblr post every day, as a Medium post every day, and as a Mastodon thread every day. And all of those links are at the top of pluralistic.net. You can also find my podcast there.
Thank you very much for doing this. Good
Hey,
talking
my
to you.
pleasure. Thank you.